Steve. Hi, everyone.
Thank you, Steve.
I want to talk to you about a simple alert system that's designed to improve measles outbreak response. Now, we all know and love alert systems, but they can be surprisingly difficult to design. And to understand why, I want to start with a little story, a story that begins, of course, in the DRC. Now, this is a massive country with more than 500 health zones, and one that faces a substantial burden of measles. And while MSF has always had alert systems in place, we have often found that we face far more alerts than we could possibly respond to, and that moreover, many of those alerts will turn out to be false. And so MSF asked the question, can't we do better? Is there not a system that would correspond better to our operational needs? And it was with that question in mind that 2 years ago, I got up here and we talked about a simple alert system, and we argued that that system could provide a more balanced alternative. Now, we will revisit what those results look like in just a minute, but for the second, supposing that they were wildly convincing, one of the first questions we might ask is, all right, but does that system work well anywhere else? And that's the question I want to focus on today. And to answer it, we're going to take a few steps. First, we're going to select countries that have differing epidemic profiles, so we can see if this system works well in diverse conditions. Then, we're going to identify admin level 2 outbreaks, admin 2 being those health zones in the DRC, from 2015 to 2024, using surveillance data from the respective ministries of health in those countries. And finally, we're going to evaluate the performance of this alert system against that retrospective data and in comparison to some common standard options. So beginning with that idea of selecting study countries, we of course will begin with Niger, with the DRC. Spoiler, the other country, sorry Steve, is Niger. Now the DRC, as we've already seen, is a high burden country and one that faces mass, often multi-year epidemics. To it, as you may have guessed, we will be adding Niger. Now this is also a high burden context, but instead of having multi-year epidemics, it shows high seasonality, with a measles season occurring every single year. Diving a little bit deeper into those epidemic profiles and finally seeing some numbers, here we can look at the number of weekly suspected measles cases at the national level in the DRC. Translating that into outbreaks, again at that admin level 2, we will find 683 in total. Now those outbreaks had a median size of 782 cases and lasted in general about 31 weeks. Doing the same for Niger, here we can really see that annual seasonality. We're going to find a total of 175 outbreaks, which are a little bit smaller, with a median size of 129 cases, and a little bit shorter, with a median duration of 21 weeks. Now that we have our historical data in place, let's finally define that alert system. Now, our alert system is based on a combination of weekly and tri-weekly thresholds of suspected cases, where that weekly threshold is simply the number of suspected cases in the current week, and we've considered a few options, 1 case, 2, 5, etc. And the tri-weekly threshold is then simply the number of suspected cases in the most recent 3 weeks, and again, we've considered multiple options. So for example, we could imagine an alert that will combine a weekly threshold of 20 with a tri-weekly threshold of 35. This alert will be triggered whenever I had either 20 cases this week or 35 in the most recent 3. Similarly, we could imagine combining a weekly threshold of 10 with a tri-weekly threshold of 15, etc. You get the point. Now this system is going to be compared to a couple options. And the first is going to be a common recommendation from the WHO, which will look for 5 suspected cases in a given locale within a single month. Now, locale is admittedly an ambiguous term, but with the data I have available for this analysis we're talking about today, I'm forced to evaluate it at that admin 2 level. The second system we'll consider is a common recommendation from MSF, which will look for trend, specifically an increase in the number of suspected cases for 3 consecutive weeks. Now, each of these systems will be evaluated against both positive and negative metrics. And today, the positive metric that we're going to focus on are the number of cases captured by response. What does that mean? Well, if we imagine an outbreak that had an alert triggered at a given moment, we're going to suppose that after that alert happens, there's a bit of delay, logistics, planning, confirmation, etc. All the cases that then arrive after this delay has ended are going to be our cases captured. Now, delay is, of course, context-specific, and for the purpose of this conversation today, we're going to suppose that it's 8 weeks in the DRC and 4 weeks in Niger. Our negative metric is then the frequency of false alerts, which is exactly what it sounds like. I have an alert, but then I have no epidemic. So putting all of this together, we're going to end up with a plot that you might remember from last time looks something like this. Now, just as a reminder, here, each of those circles represents a combination of thresholds. So this one represents 10 cases as our weekly threshold, mixed with 15 cases as our triweekly. Our vertical axis then shows us that positive indicator of cases captured, and the horizontal shows the negative of percent of false alerts. So here on the left, we're in blue. That means we're talking about the DRC. So let's go ahead and add Niger on the right. Now, one of the first things we might observe is that for a given choice of threshold, the DRC will generally capture more cases. At the same time, Niger will typically show a lower risk of false alerts. But thinking back to those epidemic profiles, this actually makes a lot of sense. Because in the DRC, we see larger, longer epidemics, giving me more time to capture more cases. But at the same time, we have very high endemic transmission, leading to an increased risk that those spurious endemic cases will trigger a false alert. And so indeed, in general, we find that this higher burden will typically result in a greater proportion of cases captured, but also in a higher incidence of false alerts. Turning now to our comparisons, let's begin with the WHO recommendation, which we would find captured 90% of cases in the DRC, but came with a substantial risk of false alerts, with 83% of them being false. Niger shows a similar story, capturing 86% of cases, while still having a 69% risk of false alerts. Indeed, the recommendation from the WHO has a performance that is very similar to our alternative system when choosing the most sensitive thresholds. More striking, however, is the comparison with trend. Here, we find that in the DRC, we would have captured only 52% of cases, while still having a 42% risk of an alert being false. Niger is no better, where we find that our system fails to capture even half of those outbreak cases. So what's going on? Why does trend perform so badly? Well, to answer that question, let's look at a couple of examples. And let's start with Mwenge in the DRC. Using the trend-based alert system, we would have found that this outbreak never triggered an alert. We can also pull an example from Niger, this time in Niamey, where once again, no alert is ever triggered. Taking now a slightly bigger outbreak, going back to the DRC, this time in Kunda, we find that finally, indeed, an alert does happen, but only at the very end of the epidemic. So what's going wrong? Well, what we see in these curves is that there is a high amount of volatility, meaning that an increase over 1 week and even 2 might then be followed by a temporary decline. And indeed, it is exactly this volatility that is characteristic of measles surveillance data, which makes trend based on raw cases an unreliable system of alert. So let's turn now from theory a bit more towards practice and spend the last couple minutes talking about implementation. So in this system, we have a lot of options, and we see in general that as we move up and to the right on that curve, we will have options that are more sensitive, ones that are going to prioritize capturing as many cases as possible. Going the other direction, we're going to have options that are more certain, which will really focus on minimizing the risk that an alert is false. But how do I pick where on that curve I want to be? Well, this is where conversations with our operational teams become so critical, and we will need to keep in mind factors like our operational goals. So let's say, for example, I am the Ministry of Health. I have a presence everywhere, and I want to be aware of anything that might be happening. Well, then, perhaps I'm going to want to prioritize sensitivity, and I'm going to choose an option that's up over here. But let's say instead that now I'm MSF and I'm focused on emergency response. Well, then perhaps I want something a little bit less sensitive, but a little bit more certain. At that point, we'll also start to think about our operational capacity. And depending on what my resources look like in this moment, perhaps I will need to even further prioritize certainty. And of course, just as a reminder, the broader context will always remain critical, and this is only one tool. Additional factors such as requirements of laboratory testing, security concerns, and logistics will always remain a critical component of how a tool like this is implemented in practice. So how have these conversations gone in our 2 exemplar countries? Well, in the DRC, 2 threshold combinations were pulled out as recommendations, one giving an option that's a bit more sensitive and the other a little bit more moderate. In practice, these have been used in collaboration with a broader prioritization framework, such that that more sensitive threshold can be used in areas identified as having a higher risk, and the more moderate system can be used everywhere else. Today, these alerts are already available on the DRC surveillance dashboard and are updated weekly with the new data from the Ministry of Health. In Niger, we've also had 2 recommendations pulled out of our options. The first, more sensitive, and the second, once again, more moderate. But by contrast, these 2 recommendations in Niger have been combined to create a 2-level system. In this way, we can imagine an outbreak that transitions first into a level 1 alert and then potentially into one of level 2. Similar to the DRC, these alerts are now available on the Niger surveillance dashboard and are updated weekly. So in conclusion, we have developed a simple measles alert system based on a combination of weekly and tri-weekly suspected case thresholds. We have evaluated this system in countries with distinct epidemic profiles and found it to outperform common alternatives. And finally, we have considered how this system could be adapted to context-specific operational needs. Looking forward, we have now received additional funding to extend this analysis in countries with additional epidemic profiles, and we'll look at areas such as those with a lower burden of measles, as well as in areas that have more limited surveillance. With that, I will stop here, thanking all of my colleagues and communities that contributed to this research, as well as all of you for your attention. Thank you so much.